The Jaipur BookMark reflects the core values of the publishing industry, and it brings together some of the greatest publishing professionals from around the world.
जयपुर बुकमार्क एक ऐसा प्लेटफॉर्म है जहाँ पे कि बिजनेस को समझने का एक अपॉर्चुनिटी मिलता है. सो आई थिंक JBM इज़ समथिंग विच इज़ फैंटास्टिक एंड पीपल हु डोंट नो अबाउट इट, उनको आना चाहिए, उनको इसका हिस्सा बनना चाहिए.
Jaipur BookMark. Come and celebrate literature, meet authors, agents, publishers. Join us at the Jaipur BookMark.
On behalf of Jaipur BookMark Festival Advisors, Aditi Maheshwari Goyal, Namita Gokhale, Naveen Kishore, Neeta Gupta, and Urvashi Butalia, festival producer Sanjay K. Roy, and all my colleagues at Team Vakats, we welcome you to the 8th edition of the Jaipur BookMark. The Indian publishing industry has grown rapidly with the world's attention converging on it. Creating a meaningful B2B platform for publishers was thus essential, and the Jaipur BookMark was conceived to run parallel to the Jaipur Literature Festival. In the 7 years since its inception, JBM has fast emerged as a nerve center for the South Asian publishing industry and is indeed a focal point where books mean business. In 2020, the world grappled with the pandemic and businesses learned to reinvent themselves and adapt to an entirely new digital idiom. JBM 2021 is being held as a virtual event and, as always, continues to bring together all stakeholders of the business of books over meaningful discussions and far-reaching resolutions. A warm welcome to all of you to this session at the virtual JBM 2021. Look back in hope, a conversation with independent feminist publishers. Susan Hawthorne, Colleen Higgs, Zoe Beck, Laure Leroy, Lennie Goodings, and Margaret Busby, in conversation with Urvashi Butalia. Feminists and independent publishers have been harbingers of innovation and change, especially in the way knowledge is understood, produced, and shared. A welcome reality when compared to decades ago, when the world's publishing space was dominated solely by men. But will independent voices continue to hold their own? Will they always remain lone voices? Or will they otherwise have to merge with large conglomerates? A path-breaking panel of publishers, including Colleen Higgs, Lennie Goodings, Laure Leroy, Margaret Busby, Susan Hawthorne, Zoe Beck, and Urvashi Butalia, discussed their struggles and inspirations, focusing on the myriad vantage points that feminists, gender diverse, and independent publishers bring to our world. By providing a platform for peripheral perspectives, they open out racially and linguistically diverse spaces, allowing for original viewpoints and inevitably alter our perception of the world. Susan Hawthorne co-founded with Renette Klein the Independent Feminist Press, Spinifex Press, in 1991. She is a poet, novelist, and author of political nonfiction, including Bibliodiversity, a manifesto of independent publishing, and her latest vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy. She's adjunct professor at James Cook University, Townsville. Her novel, Dark Matters, will be published in Tamil next year. Bibliodiversity has been translated into Arabic, French, Spanish, German, and Czech. Colleen Hicks is a writer and publisher. Her most recent book is My Mother, My Madness, published in 2020. She founded Mojaji Books in 2007, and after publishing more than 150 books, is still Mojaji's manager and publisher. She lives in Cape Town, South Africa. Zoe Beck founded the independent German press, Culture Books, in 2013. She's also a translator of the works of Meena Kandasamy, Sally Rooney, Helen Oyeyemi, Amanda Liko, among others, and a best-selling thriller writer. She has received several awards, including the German Crime Fiction Award. Laure Leroy co-founded Edition Zulman at the age of 23. She completely redesigned the catalog in 2006 with a unique visual identity. Since then, Edition Zulman has stood out with both great literary prizes and bookstore successes. In 2019, Zulman opened up to essays, the reflective counterpart of a catalogue of fiction that looks at diversity of ideas. Lennie Goodings is chair of the British publishing house Virago Press. Her authors include, among others, Margaret Atwood, Maya Angelou, Sarah Waters, and Marilyn Robinson. She has written A Bite of the Apple behind the scenes at Virago Press. Margaret Busby, OBE, Honorable FRSL, is a major cultural figure around the world. Born in Ghana and educated in the UK, she became Britain's youngest and first Black woman publisher when she co-founded Allison and Busby in 1960s. A writer, editor, broadcaster, and literary critic, she has judged numerous literary awards, including the British Book Awards, Booker Prize, and received many honors, and served on several boards, among them the Royal Literary Fund, Wasafiri, and the Africa Centre in London. Urvashi Butalia is a feminist writer and publisher. She co-founded Kali for Women, India's first feminist publishing house, and when Kali closed down in 2003, set up Zulman, a feminist publishing house of which she is now director. She has a long involvement in women's movement in India and writes and publishes widely on issues related to women and gender. Her best-known published work is the award-winning history of partition titled The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India. She is currently completing a new non-fiction work on the life of a trans woman. Urvashi, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Let me add my welcome to Jaipur BookMark as well, and to this session that we've called Look Back in Hope. I'm Urvashi Butalia, and I work with a feminist publishing house in India called Zulman. This session looks at the history of independent and feminist publishing across the world. We've got 6 amazing women publishers who each set up their own companies, speaking to us about what it was they dreamt of when they started, what was the change they wanted to make, and today, when they look back over their years of work, what is it that gives them hope for the future? So welcome. I hope you'll enjoy listening to them. Susan, so let me start by asking you that when you look back on Spinifex's life these last 3 decades, what is it that gives you reason for hope that what you've been doing has made a difference?
Well, one of the things is that we have been decades ahead in some ways, that we thought that we were 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead. Now we discover that we were 30 years ahead, because the books that we published in our first years are just as relevant now as they were then. That gives me hope, because it means that our books will last. A few won't, but that's inevitable. And I think that the hope comes from the fact that we have done very good publishing. We have excellent authors. We have authors from around the world. We have fabulous African authors, authors from across Asia, the Pacific. We have Indigenous Australian writers and elsewhere as well. And these have created a richness in our list, I think. And that's something that's very important to us.
But do you see, have they kind of made an impact in what is generally known as the mainstream? Because I imagine that the motivation with which you started 30 years ago would have been to somehow change the way knowledge is perceived, received, and what is seen as knowledge. So do you think that despite the many crises that independent and feminist publishers face, you've actually been able to make a dent somewhere?
Well, we set out to change the world, of course, but and I think we have in a few instances. So, for example, our book Ngarrindjeri Wurrawarrin, which was written by Diane Bell, along with a whole lot of Indigenous women from the Ngarrindjeri Nation, that book had a significant effect. It meant that the women who were previously called liars, then some years later, that was turned around by a major judge in Australia who said that everything they had said was true and that they were vindicated. So that is one example of changing it. I think also that we've changed some of the conversation around things like prostitution and pornography. We've certainly contributed in a major way to those discussions.
And when you look at the future, for example, what often happens is that while publishers like Spinifex and like other small independent feminist publishers across the world have really worked hard to change the way knowledge is shaped, once that becomes mainstream, they are almost like working themselves out of the system. So how do you see the future? How do you see survival?
Well, we're not mainstream, and we don't aim to be mainstream, and we don't want to pander to the mainstream. If some of our books hit the mainstream, then we're happy. But one of the other things that we've done is we've created books in different ways. We were one of the first 3 publishers in Australia to go into ebooks. When we published Suniti Namjoshi's Building Babel, that was one of the first interactive novels in the entire world. We found out later that Penguin UK was planning something along those lines. That was nice. But also in our Indigenous publishing, we've done some, recently we've done a book called Karu, Growing Up Gurindji. And that's a book in which is in both Gurindji language and in English. Gurindji is a language of Northern Australia. And when you read the book, if you read it in both languages, you get more out of it. But also, if you actually want to hear the speakers speaking their language, you put your phone over the QR code and you can hear them speaking Gurindji language. So those kinds of things have been very important, and the ways in which we've worked with Indigenous writers has been an important thing for us. And it means working slightly differently, or even working with writers whose first language is something else, not English.
So you think, you believe that all those years of really hard work and facing crisis after crisis, those have been worth it?
Oh, yes, absolutely, without question. And yeah, it's also that, we've been able to bring writers into the world that wouldn't otherwise have been published. We've published Khulud Khamis' novel Fragments, Haifa Fragments, which she is a Palestinian Israeli. Now, she's not going to be heard in Israel particularly, but we were able to publish her in Australia, and then she got translated into Italian and Turkish, and we have a Turkish author from an Armenian background. We were able to publish her book also in Australia. So it's been interesting on that front. And in terms of, they're kind of international suppressed voices, if you like. In the other kinds of areas where we've been able to publish suppressed voices is women who have been victims or survivors, really, of the sex trade. And we have an anthology written entirely by women who have left the sex trade. More recently, the detransitioners are starting to appear, women who thought that they should present themselves as male, but in fact turned out to be lesbians, now are detransitioning. We're giving voice to all of those writers as well. And right from the word go, we've been publishing writers with disabilities. We started doing that within the first couple of years. So I think that's something in Australia. There's been a big push recently for diversity in publishing. But not very many of them are really committed to it. And it's kind of, I think it's a phase. It'll go away in a few years' time, and then we'll get on to something else. So I'm not convinced by the diversity talk, even though I think it's a good thing that more diverse people are being published. You know, that is a good thing.
Thank you, Susan. That's brilliant. So you continue to hold up the flag, and thank you very much for doing that. And thank you for being with us today.
It's been a great pleasure. The one thing I wanted to say is I don't think anybody is going to take us over, because I don't think they want to take over a radical feminist press. And I think that will save us from being incorporated by the corporate sector.
That will save us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Colleen, so Mojaji is a relatively young publisher, right? What did you have in your heart when you started it? What was the hope that you carried when you started this? What did you want to do?
Okay, that's a nice question. Thank you for having me as well. So what I wanted was to publish books by women that weren't getting published, and that bigger, more mainstream publishers didn't feel had a market. And my hope was that the books would find readers and find their market. And this has happened, but I'm sure you're going to ask me about how things have shifted. Well, I hope so later, so I won't go into that. But I just really knew that there was room here for, you know, books and voices that I'd come across, or manuscripts, I should say, because I worked at the Centre for the Book for 8 years before I started Mojaji Books. And I also know what I like to read, and some of what I would like to read I couldn't find. And I also knew that there was a whole sort of group of women and sector that we weren't hearing from, you know, that they were kind of silent. And I knew that in real life they weren't silent, but somehow in the literature, in books they were. So yeah, I started Mojaji doing that. I mean, there were a few sort of like side personal reasons as well. Like I wanted to be my own boss. And I have a daughter who at that time was in preschool, and in fact in 2020 she finished high school, thank goodness, because it was a hellish year. So I wanted to be able to be there for her, and, you know, to be able to go and watch school things, and, you know, which is difficult when you have a full-time job working for a bureaucracy. So there were personal sort of small reasons, but I did also have a vision, as it were. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you the question that you wanted me to ask you, and I'm going to ask anyway, which is, how have things shifted? But I want to also ask you to add to that question a bigger question, which is that the enterprise you set out on, and the enterprise that all of us who are independent feminist publishers set out on, was nothing short of changing the world. But starting from such a small beginning, you know, one person, small press, okay, you may have people working with you doing a certain number of books a year. Do you really think that that would, I mean, that's a way of achieving or getting to the goal of changing the world?
So I guess I didn't quite imagine myself changing the world. I just saw it as a relatively small and focused thing that I was doing. Yeah, but so, I mean, it's quite exciting to feel that I've been part of changing the world in terms of how you framed that question, because I mean, I think that Mojaji, sorry for bouncing around, Mojaji has been, you know, an important player in South African publishing, even though we're so tiny. I mean, it is actually still just me, and in terms of, you know, working in the office, so to speak. I mean, obviously I use freelancers for all the production things, and then every year I have one intern. So they change every year, you know, so that's, you know, the sort of institutional memory gets lost, as it were. The only one who has it is me. But this year, in February, I've got 3 interns working for me, because, not for the whole year, but just for February, because last year's intern is going to finish at the end. And I've got a new intern who started on the 1st, whatever, and an old intern who's finishing her studies, who's going to work as much as she can. So I feel like I've got all this capacity that, you know, I haven't ever had. I mean, I think that when I started out, I thought that, you know, I would start it and it would grow, and, you know, there would be money, and it would all sort of like, we'd all live happily ever after. I didn't really think that it was going to be as hard as it is 13 years later, 14 years later. That's 14 in April this year. So, but I mean, it just is, you know, and the South African book market is very particular, and we've got a whole, so it's a strange country, because there's a very sophisticated book trade that reaches the middle and upper middle class, which in the past was white but isn't anymore. And then there's like a vast sector of people who aren't really serviced by bookshops, you know. And how does one reach those people? Well, there have been some incredible things that have happened where, especially with self-publishers who've written kind of romances or that kind of thing, and, you know, they've reached, you know, tens of thousands of readers. And it's because they have followings on social media, and I don't really know what they do, but they've managed to reach these readers, but outside of the traditional book trade. And then the book trade eventually realizes, oh my goodness, you know, and then they incorporate them. And in fact, now one of the most famous ones, Durubusani Dube, she's represented by a distributor and, you know, has sort of come more into the mainstream, as it were. But I mean, Majaji is a different story. We publish slightly more serious works, and, you know, we do have readership, but I mean, for a debut novel, if we sell 1,000 copies, that's great, you know. I mean, obviously, when I started, I never thought to myself, you know, what I want to do is sell 1,000 copies of this book. In fact, the very first novel I published, I printed 2,600 copies because I had a certain amount of money, and that was what I could afford, well, you know, what I had available. And I didn't know any better. So it took like 8 years to sell, 8 years at least to sell those books.
Wow. Okay, let me ask you one other question, which is, it's hard, no? As you've said, it's really tough to be doing the kind of stuff that you're doing. So what is it about that gives you hope?
Look, I'm much more realistic. I know a lot more than I did when I started out, obviously. And I mean, I sort of veer between despair and hope. I mean, when I actually look at the body of work that Majaji has published, I feel pride and, you know, a sense of accomplishment. And, you know, I think about each author and how their lives have changed because of their book being published, and how that book has gone on to do various things, you know, like being prescribed or selling rights, you know. So somebody who just wrote something and never imagined, for example, one of the titles, Do Not Go Gentle. I mean, it's been translated into Portuguese, published in Mozambique and Brazil. It's just been translated into French, and we also sold the North American English rights. And, you know, this book has actually, with all of the sales all over the world, I mean, it's probably sold, I don't know, maybe 8,000, 10,000. If you think about the Brazilian market, that's quite big. Anyway, I mean, it's much bigger than anything else we've ever published. So that gives me hope. But, you know, I'm getting older and I sort of worry about my own life and my own old age that's peering at me from not too far away. And I just, Majaji hasn't turned out the way I thought it would. So on a personal level, I sort of worry about how to carry on with this. But, I try not to think about that, and I just keep going and planning and bringing out new books and doing my best.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that. And I think I know what you mean. All of us are getting older, but at least the work will be there, even if we are not. So Colleen, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks.
So Zoe, when your publishing house is, you started in 2013, right?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add that in 2013, we only started as a digital publisher. And a few years later, like in 2016, 17, we started printing.
Okay, so now you do both.
We do both, or we focus on print books, yeah.
So when you started publishing, Culture House is what, am I saying it correct? Is that what your publishing house is called? How does one say it?
Well, in Germany, we call it Kulturbooks, but yes.
Kulturbooks. So Zoe is with Kulturbooks. And when you started in 2013, first digitally and then in print, what is it that you were hoping to bring to the world of literature in Germany and the world specifically as an independent publisher?
Well, to make it short, we wanted more diversity, to be honest. We thought that there were so many good stories and good writers out there who never really got a chance on the German book market. And because the expectations were maybe that sales might be too low. And we thought, well, if we do it, if we publish all these writers as ebooks, then the risk is much lower. And then we had a certain success and we thought, okay, now we can start printing and build up just a regular publishing house. And that's what we did. And we still focus on diversity, of course, and on feminist writers. And well, yes, writers from all over the world.
So how difficult is it to get in the voices which have been not really heard into a market that's so comfortable with listening to the familiar voices?
It is, I have to admit, it is difficult, but things are changing, and this is what gives us hope and what makes us really happy. For example, there are more and more bookstores, especially here in cities like Berlin, in bigger cities, where they really focus on writers of color, Black writers, international writers. And there are initiatives saying that in Germany, we need to read more books from other continents and not just North America. And this is important work. And this is what, I'm sorry, here's my cat. I have to show you. Yeah, sorry. Well, I wouldn't be a proper writer if I didn't have a cat, right?
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. Yes, I mean, it is still difficult. And of course, we don't sell millions of books, but we do get attention from the press, and we do get lots of attention from the public and from the international book festivals in Germany. And so this is, I think it's going well. I have to say it's going well, and I believe it's getting better.
So, that's really interesting, because you are, like many small independent feminist publishers, part of a worldwide movement to somehow not allow only one form of knowledge to be predominant. So when you look at that community around the world, what do you see? Do you see a sense of hope? Do you see that the change they are making will survive and will sort of get the importance that it deserves?
I've had my doubts during the past few years when all these political changes worldwide with more right-wing presidents. I mean, we're rid of one right-wing president now, but you can't really say that things are just going in one direction and it's getting better, or I mean, it is gradually getting better, but sometimes there are backlashes, and that's when I get worried, and when I see, okay, we haven't really gotten to where we really want to be, compared to like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago. Of course, things are so much better, and there's so many initiatives, worldwide initiatives, and but still, there are always signs that we need to fight, we need to be really alert, and we have to do a lot more. But still, I'm very optimistic about it. I mean, even if there are phenomena like Trump and other politicians, but yeah.
You think the world of knowledge then is perhaps more open than the political world? Is that what gives you hope, or is it just the persistence and commitment of the smaller publishers? I mean, how do you, when you see the future, you think these voices will survive?
But you can't have one without the other, I'm afraid. You can't have politics without culture, and the other way around. And all I'm saying is that these voices have to survive, and they have to become louder. And I think if we become more aware of what is going on in the world, in other countries, in other cultures, and if we talk more to each other, and if we try to understand more of what other people think, and not just look at what it's like in our own country, and maybe just our closest neighbors. We need this worldwide perspective, because otherwise we cannot survive on this planet.
And that's a lovely note, Zoe, on which we can end this brief conversation. So it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your thoughts, which are really interesting.
Thank you again for inviting me. It's really exciting to be part of this. Thank you.
So Laure, my first question to you is this. Why did you start Zulma? What were you thinking of when you started it, in terms of what did you want to do in the world of writing and literature?
Well, I should say when I started Zulma, I was, as you say, 23. I was almost a kid. So I've been learning, and it was quite, the 15 first years were just kind of apprenticeship of my, of this very complex job, which is to be a publisher. So I should say that Zulma really started 15 years later, in 2006, when I quite refounded, relaunched the whole publishing company. And then I had a very specific idea of what I wanted to do, which is mainly to publish, to get French readers to know all the beauty of the world literature. And I'm not speaking there of English-speaking world literature. I'm really speaking of all this riches of literature, all these novelists, writers all over the world who write, each one of them in their specific languages, with their specific culture and history. And this was quite rarely published in France. I know France translates lots and lots of writers and different languages, but even so, there were so many gaps, so many, I mean, the world was smaller. And I think Zulma has really brought to the French literary landscape some kind of bigger world, bigger view of the richness and variety of the world. This was really my aim, and it still is.
So, Laure, Zulma is one of the independent publishing houses that has actually been quite successful. You know, it's got a name, its list is well known. And for most independent feminist small publishers, it's difficult to reach that kind of success. So was it a real struggle for you? What was it that made for that success?
I think one main part of this success is quite independent of me and any of the quality that I could have. It remains on the qualities of the French market. We have lots and lots of independent bookstores. And I must say all our first successes were, were born with the enthusiasm of all the French booksellers. And it was really at the beginning, 1 + 1 + 1. And it was all these booksellers in all the various bookstores that we had in France that were the first people to be aware of what we were doing and to be enthusiastic about it. I mean, to understand the plan and to see that all this, what we were offering could be both very original, but would not be a difficult read or not something for quite a happy few. Everybody could enjoy our books. And really, the success of Zulma stands on this. The booksellers, which for many of them are real, good readers and mainly generous people. And then they became attached to Zulma.
That's so good to know. It's great to have that kind of supportive industry that you can actually sell books through. So let me ask you another question then, that Zulma is part of a group or large numbers of similar independent publishers across the world who are making an effort to try and change the way writing, literature, knowledge is produced and marketed and known, trying to change the canon. So when you look at this kind of publishing in other parts of the world, what do you see there as its strengths? What has it brought, do you think, to the world of publishing and literature?
It's a big question. It's a difficult, big question. Well, as the years pass, each time I go to Frankfurt Book Fair, for example, I happen to meet more and more of publishers like you and me. I think there's really a next generation coming, and what was interesting also is a kind of awakening of the American publishers, for example, because now we have quite a few of them who are really open to this kind of world literature. So now it's difficult. I don't have the big picture of that. I'm a little at loss to answer about this.
Okay, maybe that was an unfair question, but I think what you say about seeing more and more publishers like us at Frankfurt is a sign that there is some kind of change happening, despite the fact that the conglomerates are growing bigger and bigger. And
well, the other change that we can see every year in Frankfurt is also that often the bigger publishers are more and more fearful. I think it was more easy to sell rights of an unknown Korean writer 10 years ago than it is now. I mean, they're more mainstream, more under financial pressure, more and fearful. You feel that each guy is afraid to lose his job if ever this or that book were not a success. Then this gives more space to the independent publishers to take risks, and intelligent risk. and to elaborate successes that the bigger ones who would have published these books 10 or 15 years ago and who do not dare publish them right now.
That is so interesting. I find that quite fascinating. Laure, thank you so much for talking to us. Been lovely talking to you.
Thank you.
So Lenny, let me start by asking you, you've said that feminist publishing radicalized the world of publishing. When you look back at the beginnings of Virago in the 70s, you said you radicalized the world of publishing. Would you tell us a little more about how?
I think what I've been really interested about is the way movements change things like publishing, other industries too, of course. And I'm watching Black Lives Matter now doing the same thing. And it's publishers feel like they want to change or they make noise about wanting to change, but actually it seems to me they only change when you get social movements who force the change. They force different kinds of people to be in publishing. They force different kinds of books to be published because it's what I call it almost like a reader's revolution. So the readers say, you know, you're not serving me. I'm not getting the books I want. And originally, how that normally starts with feminism in the 70s, it was probably a sort of fairly smallish group actually. And it started, as you'll know, with, you know, sort of newsletters and all kinds of things, you know, very low level grassroots sort of things. And then publishing houses were born. And the publishing houses were born because women wanted a say. They wanted their voices on the page. They wanted to have their histories. They wanted different kinds of histories. And the crucial thing is they wanted different people making those kinds of decisions. And so when Virago was formed, it seems amazing now, but actually there were very few women taking decisions about what would get published. You know, in Britain, you can tell me differently in your country, but in Britain, it was mainly Oxbridge men taking the decisions. There were lots of clever women in publishing, but they tended to be assistants or editors, but not the people who would take the direction of the publishing house. So Virago was radical in the sense that it said, we women will take the decision about what will be published. But it then radicalized publishing because publishers then discovered, you know, that there was a market there that they weren't addressing, that they had these resources of women in their publishing houses who could take different decisions, talk about different kinds of books. And so that's where I feel like you get change. As I say, you get it forced from the outside, but then the publishing houses themselves change. And it's partly market driven. It's partly because the bigger publishing houses think, oh my God, something's out there selling and we're not part of it. But it's also socially driven too. It is actually saying, you know, that we people who are coming from the margins want to be in the center and make our own decisions.
So, I mean, that's really interesting, but within publishing then, to push for something new is quite hard. So how was it for you when you look back at the beginnings and the early days of Virago? How is it for you to be pushing new voices into the market? And what were sort of battles you had to fight?
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't always easy because, of course, the gatekeepers are not necessarily liberated or wanting change, are they? And I remember taking some books to Belfast in Northern Ireland. And I remember that the fellow who was the book buyer said to me, we don't want any of your books here. There are no feminists in Belfast. And obviously completely crazy. But he agreed to. Yeah. So, you know, we had to get over that. But I think that's what I meant about the social movement in the sense that there were readers out there. In a way, the readers jumped over the gatekeepers. You know, and when Virago first started, of course, the bookshop terrain was completely different. So there were a lot of radical bookshops, a lot of small bookshops. You know, it wasn't so monolithic as it is now. So there were different ways of getting in. You know, the other thing is there was no social media, of course. So we were very dependent. The only way you could get your message out was you were very dependent on the mainstream media, and that is. I think that's kind of Virago's success. So the reason we're successful here is I think that we were able to work out how you can take ideas to the mainstream. And, that sometimes involves compromise. I'm not saying it doesn't. It sometimes involves celebrity feminists, people who are very famous. It's, the way is not clean. It's not always clear, but a lot of it depends, I think, Urvashi, on what your aim is. And one of the aims for Virago is that we wanted to be mainstream. We said we want to publish from the margins. We still have this view, publish from the margins, but we feel the books and the ideas and the authors deserve a big audience. So that was always our target. It was to bring the voices from the margins, to put those voices in a book with a title and a jacket, etc., that said, this is important. You read it. It's important to all of us. We never saw ourselves as niche publishers. And I think that's quite key, actually. But that was our target. Not all the feminist presses had that target.
Not all feminist presses, yeah. Not all feminist presses have that target. You're absolutely right. And this leads me to my next question, which is, you say you didn't see yourself as niche publishers. That's really admirable. We don't see ourselves as niche publishers either.
No.
But reaching the mainstream means seeing yourself as a business and adopting a different business model, which you did. And as you say, it often can mean compromise, or it often can mean doing things which ideologically you may feel opposed to, or where you're coming from. Ideologically, there may be criticism of you, within feminist circles and so on. So I know that Virago chose to go in the end with a large publisher. And what you feel that gave you access to the mainstream, but what else in terms of strength? How did it strengthen you?
I think, to be honest, we already did have access to the mainstream because we were very, very savvy independent publishers. We knew how to talk about our books. We knew where to get the opinion formers. We knew the people. We've always had allies. I'm sure you have the same, actually. We've always had allies in bookshops and in the media and libraries, school teachers, etc. We've always had people who want to support Virago. They want to amplify our ideas. So part of it was just getting the news to those people. But we always did have, I think by the time we went to sold ourselves to Little Brown in 1995, we knew our way around the mainstream media. What we didn't have is the sort of the more might that you need in terms of bookselling. And also the bookselling world had changed dramatically. We'd had the end of the netbook agreement here. We'd had the rise of Amazon, the beginning of the chain stores. And so what going into a bigger organization for us is it gave us that muscle. It gave us that muscle to get our books out even further. But I think that the thing I would really say is that we were fully formed when we sold ourselves. It wasn't a case we chose well, or we were lucky with Little Brown, definitely, who sort of prized what we were. So there's never been a sense of, must water yourself down or asset strip or anything like that. But we arrived fully formed. I think it's harder to grow an activist press within a conglomerate, although we now have Dialogue run by Charmaine Lovegrove at Little Brown, and she's doing extremely well. So it's not impossible, but the dynamics are different, aren't they? Because in a bigger publishing house, the drive is to make more profit. And in a smaller publishing house, the drive is to survive. So you have to make a profit, definitely. But you will also take you'll make different kinds of decisions, won't you? You may pay people that, even if that book isn't going to sell as well or something, that you feel it's important. But we've been able to negotiate that pretty well, I have to say, within Little Brown. I think the whole business around money and publishing is really interesting, actually, around idealistic publishing, which I definitely consider myself part of still, actually. But it's particularly on the left, I think, is that there's a sort of suspicion of money, isn't there? That money's dirty and compromising, etc. And that's kind of what I meant, why I said that thing about, it depends where your targets are and what your aims were. And, we have always been ambitious. We've been ambitious for our books. We've been ambitious for our authors. We want to pay them properly. And we've been ambitious for our staff. We want to pay our staff to I think at the beginning, when we were still young and independent and small, it was okay to ask people, you know, to take less money for an advance, to take, you know, to work long hours for low pay. But I don't think you can, it doesn't seem to me like that can be that's not a business model that can last. I mean, that's just based on adrenaline selflessness, isn't it? And that goes quite a long way. But if you can pay people properly, and if you can sort of recognize that actually making a profit is a way of sustaining yourself. It's a way of sustaining yourself when you're independent. And what I find now, it's a way in our cases of protecting ourselves. Do you know what I mean? So long as we make a profit, people leave you alone in a big publishing house.
That's really interesting, Lenny. Thank you very, very much for joining us in this discussion. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you.
So Margaret, you and I have watched the stories of these 5 amazing women from different parts of the world who started independent and feminist publishing houses and worked really hard to bring, to change the landscape of publishing in many ways. And I think in some ways it would be fair to say that had it not been for the efforts of publishers like these across the world, and you and I, you as the first Black woman publisher in Britain, my publishing house, Zulman, which was the first, Kali and then Zulman, which was the first feminist publishing house in India, are part of this sisterhood across the world. And I think it would be fair to say that had it not been for their efforts, the voices of women, of Black people, of queer people, of trans people, all those voices that inhabit the margins of our world, that they would not have seen the light of day, perhaps not so soon, or not at this time, would have taken much longer to be there. And you so often talked about the importance of this kind of publishing, changing the landscape of publishing. So when you look at the work of these publishers and their stories, do you feel that they've made a contribution to changing this landscape? And if so, how and why do they get such little recognition?
Yes, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this sisterhood, if you like, of publishers, because it is incredible to be in the company of such inspiring women in the publishing industry. And I think part of the reason it's important is that we see that it is possible to make a difference, to have started all these ventures, these initiatives, these independent publishing companies and ongoing ventures is something that people cannot ignore. They may not have as high a profile as they should have always, but it will make a difference going forward in terms of what other people, particularly other women, younger women, women of color around the world, is possible. And I think I'm probably the oldest in the group, actually. So if you go back to when I started, it was really a very, very different landscape. And because when I'm the oldest now, but I was the youngest then, and because I was so young and so inexperienced, I didn't actually realize what the situation was, if you like. I was just doing something because I believed in it. And I was too young to know that it was actually going to be such a landmark, if you like, or such an obstacle race. So perhaps one of the things we should be grateful for is that we can encourage each other. So because I was there, somebody considers it's possible to be there. Not that I have to do anything miraculous, but it just shows that just as when I was at school, when I saw a British literary magazine, which on the front had a photograph of an African woman, a woman called Noni Jabavu. And because I could see that she had made a difference in literary circles in London, it gave me something to aspire to. showed that it could be possible. So although when I started, I wasn't setting out the same thing to publish unheard voices or anything in a very conscious way, I knew I was doing something that was possible because somebody had shown me the way, if you like. And I know there are people who've been involved, who've become involved in publishing because they saw that I had done it. So it's just a question sometimes of being there. So you are, publishing means to make a public announcement, to show something. So I think in a way, we are publishing just by being there.
You're so right, Margaret. When we listen to, the conversations that we've had with the 5 women whose stories we heard, they are truly inspirational. And I was thinking back to something that you have said in many times over in your work, which is that it's good to be the first. Sometimes it's easy to be the first because, as you yourself said, that you sometimes aren't even aware of what you're getting into, but you know that you want to do something. But it's so important not to be the only. And how are the ways in which, say, people like us can ensure that that space is opened up to others? You've done that in your life. You set up, or you were part of something called GAP, which enabled the entry of diverse voices and Black women into publishing. So could you talk a little bit about the responsibility on those who are the first to open up that space for others?
Well, I think one of the things we have to keep doing is what we're doing now, talk to each other and share our stories, share our if you like, our experiences, so that we don't have to make, if one of us has made a particular mistake, we can avoid that because we've been told that it's been shared with us by somebody else. I mean, you mentioned GAP, which stood for Greater Access to Publishing, which is an initiative in the 80s, in the 1980s, trying to encourage more diversification in the publishing industry, which is something that is still going now, 30 or more years later. But that included in it a range of women, including Lennie Goodings, who we heard of earlier, we were all coming together to try and make a difference in the industry as a whole. And I think that is something that is a continuing situation. We have to see how we come together to make a change that will last more than just, at the moment we hear a lot, particularly since the Black Lives Movement became so noticeable last year, we hear a lot of people talking about diversification in terms of ethnicity or class or whatever, including in gender. But we want it to be more than just a passing moment. We want it to continue, and we want it to have significance, not just somebody ticking a box because it's topical. So I think I am, in a way, well, there are many young publishers who started after I did, young Black publishers who've told me that they did get involved because I was doing it. And that's really wonderful here. I mean, a couple of years ago at the London Book Fair, I met a young woman, a South African woman, who said she got into publishing because she came across some Alison Busby books and she researched it and she found that I was behind it. And that made her go into publishing. In fact, she's now the publisher of John Ball in South Africa. And so her name, I don't know whether she'll mind me, mentioning her name is Nkanyezi Shabalala. Now, that was something I was not aware of. It happened decades ago, and it's a continuation of something that I was not aware I was doing, which was showing people it's possible. And other people who are coming through now, who I'm still in touch with, who there are publishers, whether it's Cassava Republic Press, which is run by Bibi Bakari Yusuf, or Valerie Brandes running Jacaranda. There are people who have referenced me. And Bibi, I'm still in touch with her. Sometimes she might have some situation in her publishing company that she needs some advice on, will touch with me, and I'm happy to, if I can help. But sometimes it's not a question of giving any practical help. It's a question of giving a shoulder to cry on, if you like, holding hands with somebody, because you've been there. You know that there are situations that are bound to occur, and that's, you know, you have to find a way through them. And I'm happy to help anybody who comes through in terms of being a woman of color, a young Black woman of color, to try and make sure that they don't give up along the way, because it's not an easy to have taken, but it's a really essential and worthwhile one.
Yeah, I think it's just so important to be there as you know, people know that if you have been there, you've done that, then it's possible. It's like, I remember the statement that Zadie Smith once made about you, saying that, you know, when there you were metaphorically shouting from the rooftops about the inclusion of Black women. And the women who looked at you said, we can, because she did. And that just your being there made it possible for them to take hope that they could do it too. So I think that's everywhere in the world. That role has been played by young, old, independent feminist publishers. And it strikes me that so many of them are women. I mean, maybe I'm prejudiced, but so many of them are women. Margaret, one of the wonderful things that you did as a publisher very early on was to bring out your anthology of writing by African women, and then a second edition or second volume of it, in which you really brought in hitherto unknown voices. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you went about that?
Well, the first anthology I edited was called Daughters of Africa, which was actually commissioned by an editor, a young editor at the time, at the end of the 1980s, called Candida Lacey. And she was actually working at that time with a feminist company called Pan, and she wanted to do a book that gave some profile to women of African descent as writers. And I'm happy to do this, because I was very conscious of the fact that you might find an anthology that said, you know, poems from Africa. It wouldn't say poems by men, or, you know, short stories Caribbean. It wouldn't say by men, but where are the women? So I wanted to do that, have a collection of well, the first volume had more than 200 women of African descent from around the world, from every genre, showing how many brilliant writers were not getting attention. It actually originally came out from Jonathan Cape, because Candida commissioned it at Pandora, then she moved to HarperCollins, then she moved to Cape. I stalked her, and so it came out from Jonathan Cape. And in 2018, we decided we wanted to do a follow-up. Candida by then was publisher of Myriad Editions. And so she commissioned me to do New Daughters of Africa, which is an anthology with another 200 women of African descent from around the world. Because again, we thought, well, although that there is more visibility now, there are still so many women of African descent who deserve to be in the spotlight. Things that I really love about this anthology is the fact that everybody who's in it, more than 200 women, most of them still, and waived their fees. So nobody actually got paid for these contributions. And because of that, able to have a sort of legacy for this anthology. So a contribution from the contributor, from the publisher, from me, and there's an award which comes out of this anthology called the Margaret Busby New Daughters of Africa Award, which means that a woman student from Africa who wants to study at the School of Oriental and at London University will get a free course of study and accommodation because of this anthology.
Wow,
and we had the first last year, she's currently doing the course. So we hope that people will keep contributing to this and we'll be able to keep this award going and just spread the word and keep the sisterhood going, because it really is something amazing that all these wonderful contributors, and they're contributors, many of them well known, but we'll say you do have the Zadie Smiths and the Chimamanda is, and a lot of the well-known names, but a lot of names that you will not have heard of. And there are lots of also intergenerational links, because, okay, we have Zadie Smith in it, but we also have Zadie Smith's mother, who is now a writer. She's now become a novelist, so she is in it. And so there's a wonderful link that's going on from the first volume, New Daughters of Africa, to the second volume, to future writers. And that's what I really love about having done these anthologies. So,
thank you. That's a wonderful story. I have the first anthology. I have to get the second one. But I remember buying the first one when it came out all those years ago. So thank you so much for working on them. But I do want to ask you a question that despite stories we heard, are all stories of, within quotes, success in one way or the other, whether the publisher has chosen an independent path or whether they've allied with a larger conglomerate and retained their identity. But there have been others who have done excellent work and then they've kind of faded out for one reason or the other. And how should we look at the contribution that those people have made? Because the attrition rate also is high because it's so difficult to survive. So I'm thinking of...
It certainly is difficult. And
no, go on.
So you're thinking of... No, it's not an easy vocation. It's not an easy mission, as we both know. And you don't go into it because you decide you want to be rich or famous, because it's not a quick route to that. And also maintaining independence isn't easy. I mean, although I started Alison Busby in 1967, and it's still going now, I have nothing to do with it now. Mm-hmm. It's became... it's now part of a group owned, I think, by a Spanish publisher. But I was editorial director for 20 years. Then, because we had financial difficulties, it got taken over, and it's still going. It's still a worthwhile publishing company. It still publishes a lot of women writers. But it's not actually connected with the original owners, the names. It's, in fact, a lot of people, I think of Dead White Man. They hear the name Alison Busby. They don't know that Busby is, a 5'2" African woman. They assume it's somebody who started it generations ago, who's a white man. And so it's something that is difficult to maintain independent as a publisher, the small publisher, and to be true to what you want to do. But I don't think one should be put off by that difficulty to say, well, I will. And also to realize that you are inspiring others, not even in terms only of being an independent publisher or a publisher at all. I mean, I was very inspired by Toni Morrison, because when I first met her in the 70s, she was the only other Black woman I knew who was an editor. She was an editor of Random House. And certainly we talked, and she told me her experiences of the fact that, within a company, if, for example, she was publishing a Black writer, she had to make sure that writer succeeded. Otherwise, the general feeling might be that Black writers don't sell, so we won't publish anymore. And I'm not sure that that's something that's gone away completely. So one can aim to be an independent feminist company, but you could still make contributions in individual ways within the publishing industry in other ways. So it's not that we all have to take on a huge burden of running a company, but we can do what we can within companies.
So in some ways, be the conscience of and provide the oxygen that actually, I guess, mainstream publishing so badly needs to keep the diversity and all those voices that need to be heard in there, right?
That's right. And to be in the room, to be taken account of, not just to be wheeled out when they want to say, yes, we've got some women here, we've got some Black people here. In fact, I used to be on many committees and advisory groups, and I used to call myself, which meant two for the price of one, Black and a woman. So they could say, so whenever I got off those committees, I had to make sure that on somebody else who fulfilled those roles. Otherwise, there'd be things discussed that didn't have anything to do with women or anything to do with Black people, and there was nobody there to make any intervention. So I think that's another reason. If you're not there, then a lot of things that may matter to women, to people of color, may not even get thought of. I mean, there's an African saying that goes something like, there are variations of it. Until the lions have their say, or the lionesses, tales of victory will be by the hunter. So unless we are there giving our perspective, it's going to be a very different story that will be told.
Thank you, Margaret. That's a lovely note on which we can end this wonderful conversation. So in closing, I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us in this: Margaret, Colleen, Lenny, Susan, Laure, and Zoe from different parts of the world. And to say to you who are readers and listeners that, here are all these wonderful people doing this amazing work, but it's up to you to meet us halfway, to be the readers who will go beyond what is so obviously available in the market and say, hey, wait, here's a book which has a different voice, and this is what I should be reading. So if you do that, we'll survive, and literature will survive. And thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Susan, Colleen, Zoe, Laurie, Lenny, and Margaret for this insightful session, which threw up many questions as well as answers. Thank you, Urvashi Butalia, for being a fabulous moderator and curating this session. A big thank you to you all for being a wonderful and attentive audience. All our sessions will be available to view later on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Once again, we would like to thank all our advisors and partners for generously supporting us. We hope you all enjoyed this conversation and will stay tuned for our upcoming session. Thank you once again. And now we present an interesting reading from the JBM short series.